friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori, and I can't wait to talk about these books. I read so many good books in November. I feel like my whole reading mood was just lifted by the books that I had this month. I'm so excited to talk to you guys about them. I have a book that is definitely going to be on my top books of the year, I think. I had a major uplift after some bad experiences with the series that I've been reading this year. 3 guesses what that is. I even read some fantastic middle grade, so overall it was just a great month. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the one book that I've set aside, the DNF, sort of. It's a soft DNF. I will probably finish this book, but I'm putting it down for the time being because I'm just not in the right headspace for it. I'm not loving it, and I want to give it a little bit of space, and that is The Black Company by Glenn Cook. This is a book that I was buddy reading with Matt on Books and some of the Fireside Discord. And I've really enjoyed listening to the conversation around this book. The reading experience of it, however, isn't really doing it for me. This is a very classic, kind of pre-grimdark fantasy. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's grimdark in and of itself, compared to what we often see in grimdark now. But it is a boots-on-the-ground military fantasy with very close up and personal character, voice, and I really thought I was gonna love this book, to be honest. There are a lot of things in this book that are just kind of making me bounce off. The writing style is very sparse, which by itself doesn't usually bother me, but I'm having a really hard time following what's happening. There's a lot of very jarring time jumps. There's a lot of lack of detail, I think. Usually I like filling in blanks, and I like it when an author gives me a little bit of space to kind of be part of the story and use my own imagination. This one's a little bit too far that direction, and I feel like I have no idea what's going on, to some degree. The characters are starting about halfway through the book to kind of take shape in my head, but overall I'm just not loving it. So I'm putting this down for now. I probably will still finish it at some point. I did get about halfway through, but I'm a pretty quick reader, and it has taken me like a month and a half plus to get through half of this book. And it's not a difficult read. So I figured that was enough of a sign that I needed to just put it down for a little bit and maybe come back to it later. The first book that I read in the month of November was Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. I've talked about him on my channel before. I've read his memoir slash fiction, Gone to the Woods, which I absolutely loved. But Hatchet is a book that so many people read growing up and absolutely loved, and I had never read it, despite having met Gary Paulsen and getting to teach with him. He's just such a cool guy, and I wanted to finally get into some of his canon of work because what a legend in American fiction, right? Hatchet is the story of 13-year-old Brian Robeson, who is flying in a single-engine plane over the wilds of Canada to visit his father, and it crashes, and the pilot passes away, and Brian finds himself completely at the mercy of the nature around him, and he's trying to survive. And this book, it's middle grade, it's tiny, it's so good, you guys. I love survival stories to begin with, and I was not expecting to be as engaged with this story as I was. One of the things that I love in a middle grade is when it is digestible for the age category it's intended for, and also it's good enough writing that it still can pull in an adult reader and add that tension and intrigue and immersion that I love to read in my adult novels. And this book so beautifully does all of that. And not only do we have the aspect of survival where Brian is trying to survive the nature around him, and that's the elements, animals, starvation, exposure, all of those things, but he's also wrestling through the dynamics of his broken family and, wrestling with a lot of really big issues for a 13-year-old kid who is trying not to die in the wilderness. This book is so good, you guys. I loved this book. And as soon as I finished it, I handed it to my 12-year-old son to read. He also absolutely loved it, and we were able to talk about it. I think this is a phenomenal middle grade, and it is no surprise to me that it is as lauded and awarded as it is. Next up was another middle grade novel that is in the self-published fantasy blog off finalist pool this year, and that is The Tenacious Tale of Tana the Tendersword. This book, you guys, when I saw that this made it into the finals of SPIFBO, I was so excited because I think middle grade fantasy is something that gets overlooked, especially in the indie industry. And in the industry of publishing in general right now, I feel like middle grade has kind of gotten lost and isn't being as heavily marketed as a lot of the other subcategories of fiction. And we need really good, solid, engaging, fun middle grade fantasy as gateway books for the young readers that are coming up into the genre. And The Tenacious Tale of Tana the Tendersword is such a glowing representation of what that can look like. The character who is telling us the story is Galdefort, who is the chronicler for Tana the Tendersword, who is a young hero who is like gathering her laurels and going out on her first quest. And they are the epitome of a grumpy sunshine combination. They are phenomenal. I love them together so much. And there's just such a fresh, fun, engaging fantasy vibe to this story. I've heard Tana compared with characters like One Piece's Luffy, which completely checks out for me. That is absolutely a spot-on comparison for her. There is a sword-fighting rooster. There is a terrible sorceress. There are like horrific lizard soldier things. There's a flying wagon. There are crying mushrooms. The world is so vibrant in this story. As Tana goes through her quest request, because it's not even a quest yet, she and Galdefort have to face a lot of things that are honestly way above their skills and capabilities level and try to survive a very dangerous antagonist. And it's such a great, wholesome read. And I think that this kind of story hopefully will open the door for a lot more middle grade fantasy, especially within the indie community. I recently had an interview with Dewey and Bill, the authors of Tana the Tendersword, which you can watch up in the cards. It was a really, really fun chat, and the guys had so many awesome things to say about the writing process and middle grade fantasy, and we had a really good time. After I finished Tana, I moved on to another book that I have had on my TBR for ages that is also a book that a lot of people read in school as part of their required reading, and that is William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies just about broke me, and I wasn't anticipating that, to be honest. Please check out my full review for more of my thoughts on this, but it's so thought-provoking. I was expecting going into it that it wasn't going to be a pick-me-up book, obviously, but I didn't anticipate that it was going to touch on so many of the themes that I find incredibly interesting about survival stories. And the prose is very easy to immerse in, and it's still very thought-provoking, which I love. I love that combination where it's very accessible prose and yet it's not dumbed down. It's not basic. It is very intentional and very interesting and gives you a lot of food for thought. This is probably one of the most thought-provoking reads I've had this year. It's definitely high up on my list of classics that I've read. Highly recommend it. Please go check out my full review for more thoughts. This next book was the culmination of a series that I've been reading this year that has taken me forever to get to, and that is Red Rising Era 2. Lightbringer follows two books that I had a really difficult experience with, Iron Gold and Dark Age, and I actually took about a 2-month break before I went into Lightbringer because I was so nervous about just finishing what was available in the series with another letdown experience. I was promised that this would be a return to form, and I am very happy. I am so thrilled to say that that was my experience with Lightbringer. I still do not love it as much as I loved the original trilogy, but this book honors the characters and the storyline and the heart of what I loved in that first trilogy so much better than the first two books in Era 2. Lightbringer felt like the heart was back in the series, if that makes sense. The characters felt like suddenly I knew who they were again. He tied up some of the loose plot holes that I really struggled with in especially Dark Age, and I feel like he is moving back into a story that I'm excited to read, which is just the best feeling, you guys. I can't even tell you how relieved I am to be able to say this to you. I appreciated being back in this world and feeling like I was back home again with these characters in the story. After the last two books, it's just such a relief. It's such a relief, and I'm happy to report that yes, Lightbringer is leagues better, in my opinion, than Iron Gold and Dark Age. However, as you might imagine, there was some very hard, heavy moments in Lightbringer, and so after I finished Lightbringer, I needed a little bit of a lighter break, and that's why I picked up Spy Family Volume 11 and 12. These are the latest available volumes in the US. I'm still loving this series, you guys. Please check out my review of the series up to this point, because I love this manga, I love the characters, I love the premise, and it's really fun. And again, I think this series would be a fantastic gateway for anybody who's interested in trying manga. It is not difficult to get into. It's very easily accessible, whether you're a fan of manga and have been forever or you're brand new to it. Volume 11 was okay. It did feel a little bit more like a filler episode versus Volume 12, which I liked a lot better. And now I'm at a point where I have to wait for the next couple of volumes, which stinks. But I'm absolutely loving this manga, and I'm really excited to keep going. Alright guys, we are now going to talk about a book that is definitely going to be in the running for my top books of 2025. I cannot articulate how much I loved this book, but I'm gonna let the annotations speak for themselves. So this is By Blood, by Salt, Book 1 of The Land of Exile by J.L. Odom. And this is so many of my personal checkboxes in fantasy. It is really intentional, world building and character focused, slow burn military fantasy. And you guys, it is beautiful. I loved this book. I loved this book so much. We enter this story meeting Azetla, who is a Moshevi conscript in a military battalion. The catch to this story is that Azetla's people, the Moshevi, are basically beyond the bottom of the totem pole in the society that they live in. They are not only hated and scorned, they're technically not even allowed to own a weapon. And there's a festival in this country every year where a bunch of Moshevi people are slaughtered to appease a violent goddess. And Azetla walks a very fine line in the position he has been trusted with in the battalion he's in, because legally speaking, he's not even supposed to be in it. The Emperor sends Azetla's battalion into the desert to capture a Sar devil. These are creatures that are myth and legend to Azetla's people and the people around him, and it's a very dangerous mission. What they actually find in the desert is not what anyone was expecting or hoping to find, and it sets off a crazy chain of events that at the heart is incredibly character layered. There is an exploration of prejudice and authority in this book that is just so incredibly intriguing. This book inspired me to take up more serious annotating, if that tells you anything. Like, the themes in this book are so interesting, and the little details that the author places within the character arcs that feed into those themes and tie the characters together are just so interesting, and I loved every minute of it. I had a horrible time putting this book down. I had an absolute blast annotating. One of my favorite parts about this book is J.L. Odom's prose. She has such a beautiful way of drawing attention to the characters through the prose, through the words that she's using, and how they connect, how those different words and phrases connect to each character. It's honestly mind-blowing. I had so much fun going back and underlining and highlighting all of the different sections that stuck out to me that I loved while I was reading this book. I want to read you guys a tiny little example of the prose. There's no spoilers in this, it's just the description of a setting. He looked out to the east, past the camp, mouthing the rhythmic closure of the prayer. Jagged and moonlit, the desert offered him harsh comfort. It was rough and unforgiving, but it never feigned to be anything else. Let it be brutal and honest rather than gentle and false. So anyways, please go read this book because I'm going to be talking about it ad nauseum for a while here because this is so good. The second book is about to come out in the beginning of 2025 and it is now my most anticipated read for next year. I cannot wait. And as soon as I can get my hands on it, I'm going to start reading it because I cannot wait. So enough about this. I'm going to put it down now before I turn this into a review video. But I love that book. Please go check it out. It's one of the best indie books I have ever read, and I highly recommend it if any of the things I talked about sound interesting to you. Last but certainly not least, I picked up a indie novella that I have had on my radar for a while, and that is Your Blood and Bones by J. Patricia Anderson. This is a fantasy horror story about a pair of young adults who are basically condemned to die by their village because they are starting to turn into monsters. They have feathers and bone shards growing underneath their skin, and they are cast out and barely escape being killed by their own people. I feel like this novella really beautifully balances the fantasy and the horror aspects of itself. I had a little bit of a hard time in the very beginning of this novella because the way that the characters were described, I saw them as being a lot younger than they actually were. So when they started talking about certain aspects of the characters, I kind of had to do a little bit of a double take because I was very confused about, wait a minute, how old are these characters? And it took me a little bit of time to really settle into the story and figure out what I was looking at. However, the boy and the girl characters, as they're referred to through the entire novella, really started becoming more endearing, especially around the halfway mark of the story. And by that point, I had a really hard time putting it down. There's something very melancholy and sad about the entire story, and yet there's like a strange beaten down hope about it that I really enjoyed. I really liked a lot of the softer elements of this story and just the kind of almost gothic undertones, but with a dark fairy tale bent. It's hard to describe without reading it, but it was definitely worth the wait, and I can completely see why so many people have recommended that I read this. All right, you guys, that is everything I read in the month of November. Please let me know again down below in the comments what you read, what you loved, what you didn't love, anything you want to let me know about your reads for the month of November. I would love to hear about it. I can't wait. I'm so excited to go into the next month and finish out 2024 and move into 2025. I have a lot of really exciting plans for next year. I'm excited for more content, more reads, and I always feel like the reads in December are something special. I don't know what it is, and maybe that's just me, but I feel like there's something almost magical about the final reads of the year, so I'm really excited about that. So anyways, I hope you guys are all having a wonderful week. If you celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you had a wonderful time and ate a lot of good food. If you are reading right now, I hope they are 5-star reads, and I'll see you in the next video.